Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for NVMe Plugfest number 8. My name is Kerry Munson. I am the Operations Manager at the UNH-IOL for our Data Center Technologies. I will serve as your host for today. Joined with me will be David Wolf, Senior Engineer in our Data Center Technologies. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. We encourage you to submit any questions that you might have, and these will be addressed at the end of the presentation. All right, so let's get started. So, who are we? The University of New Hampshire is located in Durham, New Hampshire. We just celebrated our 150th anniversary last year. The university is a fairly modest-sized school, only roughly 15,000 students. The Interoperability Lab is a third-party laboratory dedicated to network testing. We've been around since 1988. We work with a whole bunch of different technologies ranging from Ethernet, storage, broadband technologies, etc. In 2012, the IOL joined with the NVMe org to manage the integrators list for the NVMe test program. So coming up next month, we will be hosting NVMe Plugfest number 8. This will be held at our facility in Durham, New Hampshire. The dates will run from October 30th through November 2nd. The agenda for today is as follows. I will be joined by David to cover the first topic, but before we jump into this, I want to bring your attention to a few terms that you will see used throughout the presentation. We just want to be sure everybody understands exactly what we are referring to. And if you have any questions about it, please feel free to ask. So with that, I'd like to hand the presentation over to David.
All right, thank you, Kerry. So we'll be talking about NVMe over Fabrics, and this is kind of the exciting new item that'll be happening at this Plugfest. It's actually the 8th NVMe Plugfest that we've done. The second time we've addressed NVMe Fabrics, we did do that at Plugfest number 7 and on an informal basis. But at this Plugfest number 8, we'll actually be addressing Fabrics in a formal way through our testing and also making that part of our integrators list program. So as part of talking about Fabrics, I'm going to talk about 4 things. First, the requirements for the integrators list and talk about the types of products that can be eligible for that. I'll go through the interop and conformance test really at a high level and just give you some reference of specifically on the conformance test where you can find some more detail on those. I'll go into the conformance test tool, and then finally a walkthrough on using that test tool over an NVMe Fabric. And that'll also serve as a walkthrough for using the tool on PCIe, since the functionality will be very similar. So first, a little bit about the NVMe-OF integrators list requirements and the types of products that are eligible. So we've designed the program so that Rocky initiators and targets, Ethernet switches, and also Fibre Channel initiators, targets, and switches will all be eligible for this first revision of the NVMe over Fabrics integrators list. And the details on that are documented in the NVMe integrators list policy document, version 8, to correspond with Plugfest number 8. We have a hyperlink here. If you actually go to the integrators list pages on the UNH-IOL site, you'll also see a link to the integrators list policy document. So all of that is, the formal documentation of that is in the policy doc. And that's something that UNH-IOL worked very closely with the NVMe org Interop and Compliance Committee to set up and define those requirements. As far as the actual test requirements, for the initiators, whether they're Fibre Channel or Rocky initiators, we want them to pass the interoperability tests with at least 2 Interop partners. Now, those 2 Interop partners, it could be different products with different hardware. It could be the same hardware with a different operating system or driver, and that's going to apply to all of the Interop partners that I'm going to talk about here. Next, for switches, same thing. We want those switches to pass with 2 different target Interop partners, just the Interop test. Now, the requirements for targets are a little bit different. Yes, we want those targets to pass the NVMe-OF Interop tests with 2 initiator Interop partners, but we also have a set of conformance tests for targets. So that makes the targets a little bit unique. There's no conformance tests for initiators or switches at this time, but there are some conformance tests for targets. And if you're familiar with the Integrators List program for PCIe-based SSDs for NVMe, it's the same thing. There's some conformance tests for drives for SSDs, but only interoperability requirements for PCIe switches and PCIe hosts. So we've kind of mimicked the same thing here. So just to iterate that, 2 Interop partners for initiators and switches, and then 2 Interop partners plus the conformance tests for targets. Now you'll note when we refer to the requirements for targets, we say pass the NVMe protocol conformance OF test. And I'll get to what that designation means in a little bit. So first, to understand those Interop tests, I've got a diagram here that gives you a rough look at what the Interop setup is going to be. And we've gone over this in the Interop and Compliance Committee for NVMe. We're very interested in testing Interop in a multi-switch environment. So you'll see here, you'll have an RNIC for RDMA or a Fibre Channel HBA in a server, connected through 2 switches. Now, depending on the technology, those could be Ethernet switches, they could be Fibre Channel switches, and then connect that to an NVMe-OF target. Again, could be a Rocky or Fibre Channel target. So that gives you a rough idea of what the hardware setup is going to be. I'm going to provide some more details on that in the following slides. For the details on what the actual Interop tests are, you can look on this hyperlink here, the NVMe-OF Interop Test Suite document. That's also published on the UNH-IOL site. That's also been reviewed by the NVMe.org Interop and Compliance Committee. But to just give you a summary of what those tests are going to do, you'll see here listed on the right, really 4 steps, and there's 4 prime Interop tests that we're going to do. First, discover the target across that multi-switch fabric. Second is send some traffic, send some IO, and ensure that no errors have happened. Third, do a link pull. And so we'll do a link pull, make sure that the target disappears, plug it back in, make sure that the target is reinitialized and rediscovered by the host. And then finally, a test where we do a series of different power-ups to make sure that each time the target is discovered properly. So that's just a summary of what we're doing for the Interop test. Of course, for more detail, please look into that Interop Test Suite document. It's published on the UNH-IOL site, and there is a hyperlink here on this slide. So a little bit more detail to understand exactly what hardware we're expecting to use. I have a diagram like this, both for Rocky and for Fibre Channel. So for the Interop test, we'll be using a Mellanox ConnectX 4 100 gig Ethernet NIC on a server running CentOS 7 and the kernel 4.12. So that's a kernel that supports NVMe Fabrics. That's an upstream kernel. That's not something that CentOS 7 ships with. But this is the setup that we're using at UNH-IOL, and so I'm publishing this information to help you if you're trying to replicate the setup that we're using. We'll connect to the target through 2 EdgeCore 7712 100 gig switches running Cumulus Linux. These switches are they're open networking switches. They're fairly forgiving when it comes to protocols being enabled, compatibility with different cables and optical modules and things like that. So those will serve as at least the basis for our Interop setup. And then finally, as far as the target end, we have, again, a Mellanox ConnectX 4 HBA running in another server, acting as an NVMe Rocky target. So any product that you want to do interoperability testing with, it can be substituted in depending on if it's an initiator, if it's an Ethernet switch, depending on if it's a target. It can be substituted in at any point in this kind of reference test setup. And of course, at the Plugfest, there'll be other companies coming, bringing their own initiators, bringing their own switches, bringing their own targets. And so those two can be substituted in kind of at any appropriate point in this setup to create that need to test against two targets or two initiators. But this is kind of the static setup, if you will, that's at UNH. So if you want to be able to test against that or replicate that, this is the exact hardware that we're going to be using. And this is up and running in our lab today. Similarly, on Fibre Channel, we're going to do something very similar, but the hardware is obviously a little bit different. So we're hoping to use a HPE Store Fabric 32 gig Fibre Channel HBA in a SUSE/12 server. That's another server that has support for NVMe Fabrics, and connect to the target over a Brocade G620 Fibre Channel switch. And again, the Fibre Channel device, whether it's a target, whether it's an HBA initiator, whether it's a switch, could be substituted in at any appropriate point in this interop setup to perform the interop test. So that gives you a little bit better idea of what hardware we're aiming to use for those interop setups. As I mentioned, the Ethernet 1 is up and functioning at the lab now. On the Fibre Channel side, we're still working on getting these set up at the lab, but this is the hardware that we're targeted on using. I'm going to switch back to the conformance test for NVMe-OF targets. When I first introduced that, you noticed that targets had to be tested against the NVMe-OF or NVMe protocol conformance OF test. And so essentially what we've done is gone through the NVMe protocol test suite that's based on the NVMe base spec and looked for the test that applied to Fabrics at an NVMe protocol level. So I want to be very clear here. This is not a testing of the NVMe-OF specification. This is not a testing of the NVMe-OF binding specification. It's a testing of the NVMe base spec over a Fabric transport. So lots of things that are going to get tested here are simple reads and writes, get logs, things like that, basic NVMe protocol. And so if you go to the NVMe Conformance Test Suite, again, there's a hyperlink here. It's published on the UNH-IOL website. As you go through that document, you'll see that there are some NVMe protocol tests that have an OF in the title. And so I've given an example of that here. Those are the ones that we've identified as applying to Fabrics. There's some that simply don't apply to Fabrics devices or perhaps can't be implemented over Fabrics. So we've taken some time to identify the ones that specifically apply to Fabrics. And those are the ones that are going to be implemented by our test tool for NVMe-OF. A little bit more about that NVMe-OF test tool. We're putting together editions of this for both Fibre Channel and Rocky. The Rocky version is already published. You can go and download that and use that today if you're interested. Still polishing some things on the Fibre Channel version, but hoping to publish that soon. And again, the purpose of this test tool is not to test NVMe-OF specification. It's not to test the binding spec. It's to test NVMe protocol functionality over that transport. Also, keep in mind that this conformance test tool is for targets. So if your product is simply an initiator or a target, or I'm sorry, a switch, you only need to worry about the interop test. If your product is a target, then yes, you need to worry about the interop test and the conformance test. And that's what this test tool will perform for you. So a little bit about the hardware setup for the conformance tools. Very similar to the interop test setup, except that including those two switches in the middle is not required. So I've put those two Ethernet switches kind of in a dashed line to indicate that we may or may not perform the test without those. Really, they should have no effect on the NVMe protocol conformance that's being done for the tool. So it's fine to do the conformance test either directly connected in a single switch environment, a multi-switch environment, any one is acceptable. But remember that for the interop test, we did specify that we do it with a multi-switch environment. So we had those two switches. This hardware diagram that I'm showing here, in a few more slides, I'm going to do a walkthrough of our test tool and show you how that works and show you some of the setup of this exact setup here. Similarly for Fibre Channel, Again, same HBA, same switches as, or we may use the same switches as we did for the Interop setup. Very similar here for the conformance test. So now we're going to do a walkthrough of that NVMe-OF test. Really, if you're familiar with the UNH-IOL INTERACT test tool, this is a version of that that implements the tests that apply to Fabric devices and works over a Fabric transport. And in this case, the walkthrough that I'm going to show you is specifically for a Rocky transport. Of course, the same could be done for a Fibre Channel transport. If you're interested in replicating this, a couple things to keep in mind. First, the operating system, which I pointed out before, it's CentOS 7 with the 4.12 kernel. The hardware, we were using a Mellanox Connect X4 LX NIC. Other NICs may work fine, but this is the one that we're using and that we're supporting for the time being. But really, any NIC that works with the NVMe CLI toolbox should be acceptable. And a lot of what we've done here is based on the tutorial that Mellanox has published about using that HBA in an NVMe-OF Fabric environment. I've provided that link here if you're interested in replicating what we've done. But again, any NIC that supports that NVMe CLI toolbox should work here. So getting into the walkthrough, first, we've got two systems set up, one on initiator side, one on target side. They both have those Mellanox HBAs in them. And all we're showing here is what modules are installed on each one. And so you'll see on the initiator side, there's NVMe RDMA and NVMe drivers. On the target side, NVMe TRDMA and NVMe target drivers. So you have one system acting as the initiator and one system acting as the target. Moving to just the target side, if you go into the working directory where that NVMe target is configured and you use the tree command, it'll show you what targets are configured on this system. So a couple things I want to draw your attention to here. First, that NVMe TRDMA circled, that's the NVMe qualified name for the target. And then the namespace ID. In this case, we just gave it the name 10. That doesn't mean 10 namespaces. That just means the namespace ID that we assigned was the number 10. Now, keep that in mind. That's going to come up again in this walkthrough. Moving over to the initiator side, if we want to discover that target that's connected over Rocky, we can use the NVMe discover command. And there's a couple flags in that command you can see at the top. T is for the transport type, in this case RDMA. A is the address, simple 192.168 address on this network, and also the port number. So the IANA port number assigned for NVMe-OF is 4420. And so you see we perform that discovery command, and we find again that the NVMe qualified name shows up. The target that we configured is discovered by the initiator across that Ethernet network, that NVMe T-RDMA. So once we've discovered it, we actually want to connect to it. So you can use the NVMe list command. And in this shot, you see we do the NVMe list command. And first, no targets are shown because we haven't connected to them yet. Next, we do the NVMe connect command, identify the NVMe qualified name and again the address, perform that connect, then do the list again. And now you see that a 400 gig NVMe drive is now connected. And this drive is connected over a Rocky interface. You see that the namespace again is 10. That's the one that we had previously assigned. And so you've successfully attached an NVMe target over Rocky. All of these steps that I've just outlined need to be done manually before performing the conformance testing. So now that that target is attached, you can use the IOL INTERACT to run any of our conformance tests that are available in that test tool. So you can kind of see at the top of the screenshot here, we've got that NVMe list command, we've launched IOL INTERACT, and we've performed test 1.1 case 3. If you're very familiar with our test, you'll know that that is an identify command requesting a namespace list. So this is what gets shown in the GUI. In this case, the test passes. On the next slide, I'll show the verbose log that gets produced for that particular test. And here you can see the namespace ID shows up as A. That's simply because we format it differently. Obviously, that's the same as 10. So a little bit of work here still needs to be done on cleaning up the formatting of the logs and so forth. So that shows you the NVMe protocol conformance testing being performed with UNH-IOL INTERACT test tool over Rocky. Next slide is another test that we performed. This is test 1.3, case 1. This is a simple get log page command. And the reason I show this here is it's kind of a more interesting log. So we've actually parsed out the information that comes back in that get log page. So this is another example of that verbose log that gets produced by the IOL INTERACT tool. So just giving you an idea of how that tool works. So that's the walkthrough of the test tool. And like I said, at this particular event for Fabrics, we're going to focus on interop testing for initiators and switches and interop and conformance testing for targets. In the future, some things that we may address, depending on what the community needs, we may add conformance testing for NVMe-OF initiators. That's been suggested as a possibility in the future. We may expand the number of interop partners that are available for qualifying for integrators list. We may add NVMe-OF conformance and actually looking into those binding specifications. All of that is future work, and that'll be discussed on the NVMe Interop and Compliance Committee calls. But again, like I said, that's future work. So that's the NVMe-OF Fabrics. Like I said, that was something new that we've added for this Plugfest, and should be very, very interesting. I'm excited to work with people on this new technology. So with that, I'll hand it back to Kerry, and Kerry's going to talk about the regular PCIe-based NVMe testing that we do.
All right, thank you, David. So right here we have listed the conformance test requirements. Each SSD will be set up to test with both PC Edition and LaCroix Edition IOL INTERACT. If you do test with both and pass, we will not require any further review. Both these tests take approximately 30 minutes, so it's a pretty quick test compared to the interoperability tests. We will allow for a longer period of testing just in case there is any debugging that needs to take place. I've included a link right here to the test suite, so feel free to take a look at that. Now I'm going to pause here and take a moment for you to glance through the list of test cases here. If you have any questions about anything written, please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A. Next off, we have the interop test requirements. Each SSD or product will have to go through at least 5 systems for the read and write test, plus a boot test. U.2 devices will have to go through the hot plug test. We will be running these tests with the VDBench software. You can find the scripts on our file share. If you need access to this, please feel free to contact me and I will assist you with getting access. We've also included the link to the Oracle site where you can download the VDBench directly. As I mentioned before, the interop tests take a little bit longer, approximately 90 minutes. However, over the summer, we've made some progress in making these tests automated, so this should help to save time. And again, I've included the link to the Interop. So here's a look at the systems that we will be using for our interop testing. The read and write tests, hot plug and boot tests are all included here. These are the same systems that we use throughout the year, even during our regularly scheduled reservations. You can also find these listed on our website. I've included the link right here as well. Next on the agenda is test updates for NVMe. So currently, we do not have any interop tests for this. We will have one station dedicated to the MI testing at the Plugfest. All products that have signed up to do the MI testing will be scheduled for this. Do note that there is a separate integrators list from the NVMe PCIe SSD integrators list that has been in existence for about the last 5 years now. So if you sign up to do the MI testing and don't pass it, not to worry, this will not affect your product qualifying for the regular integrators list. All right, we do know that there is a issue with test 8.5. Information on this is outlined right here. The ICC is aware of this and is willing to provide a waiver if the DUT does run into this problem. Up next is test tool updates. Right here, we have a screenshot of both the PC and LaCroix edition GUIs. There was a release for both editions earlier this month. The latest version is version 8.0. This is the version that we will be using at next month's Plugfest. You can get the download directly from the box file share. And if you need any help accessing this, again, please contact me directly and I will work with you to get access. And as a note, this is only for the PCIe-based SSD testing. All right, so for the PC edition, version 8.0, it was released in 2 parts. We highly recommend that you download both packages and run them both. We are working to integrate them just so that it's a little more convenient to use. The functionality should not change, but if you do notice any issues with this, please let us know. All right, right here we have a basic setup of the PC edition. Up next is the LaCroix edition Interact update, version 8.0. Change that happened with this release was a GUI change. We're able to run more tests at once. And there are 5 new test cases that were previously only supported by PC edition. These are listed right here. And here's a setup of the LaCroix edition conformance test. Do note that this is the exact same setup as for the NVMe-MI setup. Different than PC edition, but yeah, take note. This table is each of the tools that we will be using for the conformance testing. Both IOL INTERACT test tools are here. The test tools for MI, NVMe over Fabrics, and OGate's test tool. Each of the tests that require this tool is listed here, as well as where you can find it and the requirements in order to run this test tool. Up next is bug reporting. If you are running our tests and notice that there is an issue, we have come up with a bug reporting system right on your My IOL. All you need to do is log in with your username and password. Once you log in, you will see this screen right here. And on the right sidebar, you would click on the Report a Tool Issue. Then you would locate the test tool that you are working with. So whether it's PC Edition or LaCroix Edition, you'd select that and then fill out your problem and submit the report. We will be notified of this issue and try to get back to you as soon as possible. So how to prepare? Be prepared. Please download the latest test tools and run them. I've included links to where you can download PC Edition and LaCroix Edition, as well as the licensing agreement. The licensing agreement will only send us the agreement. We then will receive the agreement and send you the license directly. So if you fill out the agreement and don't get a license back automatically, that's okay. That is supposed to happen. If you don't hear back within a day, please contact me. Please bring 2 samples of each product. The Interop test requires 2 samples. The conformance test will only require 1. If you can bring additional samples, that could be helpful in the event that one of the samples isn't working, or if a time slot opens up and you're able to test another station. If you require any special adapters, we ask that you please bring those. We only have a very limited amount. And last is logistics. So at our lab, we do have mice, keyboards, monitors available. We do have wired and wireless internet. We do have a soldering station if you require that. Contact us ahead of time if you do know that you require anything in particular, and we can make sure to have that available for you when you arrive on Monday. Please no photos. You may see representatives from the UNH-IOL walking around taking generic photos. If you're unsure of who it is, please let myself or any one of the IOL staff know, just so we are aware. But if you would like a photo taken of your team or your equipment, let us know and we'll help you out with that. So if you are traveling from far away, there's some information here on how to commute from either the Manchester or Boston airport. Our shipping address is listed right here. We ask that equipment arrives to the IOL a week before the event, just so that there is no delay. If you require an invitation letter for a visa, please contact me directly and I will assist you with that. If you're driving here, we will be providing everybody with a parking code, which will allow everyone to park for free for the week. Our parking lot is in the Mill Road parking, which is the blue lot listed in this map right here. And we've drawn a path from the lot to the IOL. It's only about a 5-minute walk. There is parking closer to the IOL on the street. Unfortunately, the code will not work for those parking spaces. All right, so as I mentioned before, the Plugfest will run Monday through Thursday. Doors open at 8 a.m. and we will probably test until 6 p.m. On Monday morning at 11 a.m. we will have a kickoff meeting, kind of go over some of the items that we discussed here on today's webinar and a few other last minute topics. We will have a light breakfast and lunch provided each day, as well as a social evening the Wednesday of the event. The schedule will be available after registration closes, probably a week afterwards, and that just will allow for any discrepancies. People can have a chance to take a look at it and come back to us. All right, and as I mentioned, registration will close October 3rd. There are 2 products that are able to be listed at one time. If you do have more products, they will be placed on a waiting list. For engineers are able to come per company. If you do have additional engineers, there will be a small fee. All right, so with that, I am going to hand it back to David. There has been a few questions that have come in, so.
Great, thank you, Kerry. Yeah, thank you to the folks that put some questions in. I'll walk through those right now. And certainly if you have questions still, feel free to drop those into the Q&A box, and we'll see if we can get to them before we wrap up here. So the first question that came in was related to what transports we'll be testing NVMe-OF over, if we'll be testing Rocky V2, and also iWarp. Right now, we're focused on Rocky V2. That's what we have set up and running at UNH, at least on the Ethernet side. We've tried to make sure that the tests themselves are transport agnostic, and I'll be returning to that idea, so that it should be relatively easy, got my fingers crossed there, to add Rocky and iWarp in the future. But as far as the setups that we have available right now at UNH, it's Rocky V2. The next question was if there's been any NVMe-OF meetings, and highlighting that there have been some for Fibre Channel. So for folks that are interested in this testing and discussing it, maybe further more detailed questions about how we're doing it and what we're doing, I'd recommend joining the NVMe Interop and Compliance Committee calls. Those are every other Tuesday, typically, at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 a.m. Pacific. The next call is going to be September 26th, so next Tuesday. If you want to be on the distribution for that and get the meeting updates and minutes and so forth, you can subscribe via your account on nvmeexpress.org, since that's a work group within NVMe Express. Next question. Someone asked if the target adapter needs to have an actual NVMe device behind it, or if it can use a virtual RAM driver in the host. The only one that we've tested at UNH-IOL is with an actual NVMe device behind the target adapter. I don't foresee any issues using just a RAM driver, but like I said, the only one that we've tested is with an actual SSD sitting behind the target adapter. So if that's what you're interested in testing, if you're interested in testing an NVMe-OF target, I would recommend bringing an NVMe SSD to sit behind your target adapter, just to make sure. That would probably line up the closest to what we've been testing here. But again, nothing's jumping out at me that says that virtual RAM wouldn't work. So next question was about how long does it take to run the tests. The conformance tests usually run in about 30 minutes. They go pretty quickly. The interop testing usually takes about 90 minutes. So that's what we're planning there. Question about the slides and where they'll be posted. We're going to send a follow-up email to all the registered participants to this webinar with a link to the slides. So we'll be sure to send those to you. You feel free to share them with your colleagues. One other slide here asking about things that the FCIA is planning and how that relates to what NVMe org is planning. So this is actually a pretty good question. You may be familiar that FCIA is going to be having an event also here at UNH-IOL the same week. And so it's good to maybe highlight kind of why they're scheduled at the same time and also some of the differences around them. So the FCIA events really are focused on, well, Fibre Channel interoperability. And yes, they will be testing FC-NVMe and digging into some interoperability issues there. They will probably do a much deeper dive into Fibre Channel specifications and also into the Fibre Channel and NVMe binding specification. And that's something that needs to be done, of course, in order for all this stuff to work. What's going to happen on the NVMe side is a verification of the NVMe protocol. We're not going to do a deep dive into the NVMe-OF binding specification. Keep in mind, too, that while the FCIA events are focused on proving out Fibre Channel interoperability, the NVMe event has more of a focus on preparing devices for the NVMe-OF integrators list. So a little bit different focus there. As far as why they're at the same time, it's simply a matter of convenience for folks that may want to attend both. So they may have products that need to be tested at the FCIA event, and they want to do that deep dive on the binding spec and on other Fibre Channel issues. They're also interested in qualifying for the NVMe-OF integrators list, and so having these at the same time is some convenience for them. And I think FCIA has been very forward thinking about that and trying to help out their members there. The Rocky side of things, again, we're not going to be diving into the NVMe-OF binding specification for Rocky. Rocky interoperability and conformance is handled by IBTA, InfiniBand Trade Association. They're actually doing some events at UNH-IOL, I believe, either 1 or 2 weeks ahead of this NVMe event. So that's really where the Rocky conformance and interoperability testing lies. Of course, anybody that's interested in NVMe-OF testing, whether it be Fibre Channel or whether it be Ethernet, we'd really welcome your input on the ICC calls, or even just contacting UNH-IOL or emailing the ICC, NVMe Interop and Compliance email reflector directly. Speaking from an NVMe perspective, we want to make sure that that test, again, is transport agnostic. And we're going to try and have very similar procedures for verifying NVMe protocol over a variety of transports. So if you have questions about that or concerns about that, it'd be great to have that input on the ICC. We understand not everybody is a member of the NVMe org. So I don't really have a great answer for helping you to participate in those calls if you're not an NVMe organization member. But let me think some more about that. Certainly feel free to contact us at UNH-IOL directly if you have questions, but I'm gonna have to dig in more to see how we can get input from folks into the NVMe ICC. Keep in mind too that all of the test procedures are published publicly on the UNH-IOL site, so anybody can go take a look at those and provide feedback. So it is a little bit of a complicated thing since we've got several different specifications, different technologies, different industry associations working together. So understandably, it's a complicated situation. Another question about how many products someone can bring. So let's see. So in the example provided, a company has a Fibre Channel initiator and Fibre Channel target, and also a Rocky initiator and Rocky target. So that, and they say, how many devices is that? At first glance, that looks like 4 products to me, because they would potentially be listed differently on the integrators list. So that's actually a good question. Maybe I can abstract it a little bit. Someone may have a Rocky NIC or Fibre Channel HBA that can operate both in initiator and target mode. And so if it is tested as an initiator and passes those interop tests, it would go on the integrators list as an initiator. If it can also operate in target mode, we would run those interop tests also on it in target mode and also perform those conformance tests in order to list it on the integrators list as a target. So even though that hardware may be identical between those two products, or between that product rather, since it's tested with different software in each case and in a very different configuration, we'd actually look at that as two different products. So, okay, another question has come in here about the PC Edition 8.0 software, about why this is split into two packages. So we have one package that is very similar to what we offered for Plugfest number 7 and does probably what we might consider some lower level tests and maybe testing some more PCIe functionality. The second package, and as Kerry mentioned, we're working on integrating those into a single GUI just to make things more convenient. That second package is some of those tests, in fact, many of those tests, re-architected using a different driver, also supporting some better and more clearer test logs. So we will be testing those the same way at the NVMe Plugfest. We're going to try and get them integrated into a single package by the Plugfest time, but there's obviously a chance that we won't be able to do that, and we'll run them separately. And let me see if there are any other open questions. There's none at the moment. We'll give people another few seconds to see if there's any other questions coming in. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in. Certainly, if you have more specific questions, Kerry's contact information is provided here. Feel free to reach out to her. And with that, I'll hand it back to Kerry for just some closing comments.
All right, thank you, Dave. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. And as David mentioned, if there are any other questions that come up afterwards, please feel free to reach out. And as a friendly reminder, we will be sending out a link to this webinar shortly after the presentation wraps. So on behalf of the UNH-IOL, thank you again for joining us today, and have a great day.